You're very welcome to the Irish Political Roundup with me, Roisin de Chleirigh.
And me, Paul Brophy.
Paul, what is the topic of the conversation for this week's show?
Well, Roisin, we're dealing with one of the biggest topics that's impacted on Ireland, and it's been going on a number of years, and it may take a little bit longer to solve as well. It's housing, and as they said, this housing situation in Ireland, it's complex, it's multifaceted, but we have a very good panel with us today to have a look at that and to discuss it and see what the challenges are and what solutions lie ahead as regards to housing situation. So we'll go ladies first. We're delighted to be joined by Regina Mangan. Regina is a auctioneer based in Waterford, and she's the owner of Liberty Blue, which has been in business for over 26 years. And Regina is very passionate about housing and how we can solve the housing crisis. I'm also delighted to be joined by Joanne Madden. Joanne is a mortgage broker with ABC Mortgages, which have offices both in Limerick and Dublin. And Joanne brings a wealth of experience in the area of mortgages. And finally, last but certainly not least, Noel Sherry. Noel is the CEO of both Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association and the Good Shepherd, which is a homeless and service based here in Kilkenny, which has been in existence since 1989. Noel has been working in the area of housing and homelessness for many, many years and brings a wealth of experience. And we're delighted to have you all here on the Irish Political Roundup.
Certainly are. So housing is becoming more and more a pandemic than anything else right now here in Ireland. You know, I have a daughter and I have a son, and there's no hope of them even getting a mortgage or being able to afford a house. And my daughter is a doctor and my son's in the Defence Forces. And Paul, you are a single man as well, and
Yep.
It's really hard to get the housing crisis sorted out.
Yeah.
Regina, you are an auctioneer. We'll come to you first. What are you seeing and hearing on the streets, and what are you experiencing as an auctioneer?
I suppose, first of all, good evening, and thanks for inviting me to contribute on this important discussion. In terms of the market, the supply levels are still quite low. Even though My Home, the property portal, have stated that there is a 22% increase in March 2023 compared to this time last year. But there's 309 properties advertised in all of County Waterford. That's second-hand properties. But it's down since last September, and there were 388. Last year was a crazy year, and the year before, the market was seriously overheated, multiple bidders, total frenzy. That's all changed, and mainly changed because of the changes in interest rates, which Joanne will speak about later. There is still a significant demand for the purchase of homes. We're involved in a new homes development, Summerfields in Kilbarry and Waterford, and there's an affordable housing phase to that, which means that some people can actually get a mortgage that wouldn't previously been able to get a mortgage. However, I would say that's not enough, because there is a cohort of people that even with the affordable housing scheme, they still wouldn't qualify to buy a new home. And I think the government needs to do a lot more. So I had a really interesting conversation with a friend of mine who was telling me that 15 years ago, actually 20 years ago, she bought a house through a scheme that Waterford City and County Council ran, whereby she had only to pay a €5,000 deposit, okay? Yeah. And she was able to buy a second-hand home for 175,000 and on a shared equity scheme with Waterford Council. So Waterford Council then had 20% equity, and over 3 to 4 years, she was in a position herself to buy back the property and own it in its entirety and go through the mortgage scheme. But like, she was in her early 20s, she was earning 24,000, she was a single mother. So fast forward to today, if she was in today's environment, she wouldn't be able to buy a house. She wouldn't be earning enough. And so I think a scheme like that would be really amazing. It would do multiple things in terms of the rental market, which I know you're going to come to shortly. Yeah. That's a seriously dysfunctional market that's in absolute crisis. And so imagine if this same lady, we'll call her Mary, fast forward her situation to today, she wouldn't be able to buy that house with 5,000 deposit and do a shared equity with the council on a second-hand home, because the affordable housing schemes are only for brand new homes. Right. To me, that doesn't make any sense. So imagine, where would she live? She would be forced to rent. And because of the handful of properties that are available, what rent would she pay? She'd probably have to get HAP.
Yeah.
Now, HAP is a government funding subsidy, and it's a false economy. It's a false economy because the government is taking money and borrowing all this money to pay the private sector, and it never has any equity or stake, and people aren't getting onto the housing market. And I blame politics for this, because there's no long-term strategic thinking. It's all about seats and getting voted and making so-called popular choices, which the public don't, I think, often really understand, because there's such an anti-landlord sentiment out there, and small landlords are not typically rich people. So they are racing out of the market. We don't have stock. We don't have any kind of system to help people get on the housing ladder that are outside a certain earning bracket.
Yeah, exactly. And Noel, so as you're dealing with this housing crisis day in, day out, would you share a lot of the sentiments that Regina has just mentioned?
Yeah, of course. I think, I know, say for example, if you consider the instability of rents, if I could start there, like in 2022, rents in Kilkenny, for example, went up by 12%. What we're finding is that many young families are spending somewhere between 60 and 70% of their income on rent, particularly closer to Dublin, which is unsustainable. Because that doesn't factor in childcare costs, it doesn't factor in the running of a car or two, it doesn't factor in grocery shopping. I always welcome to hear of an affordable housing scheme, and occasionally I do hear about them, and they are absolutely fantastic. Allowing people on a slightly lower income to access the housing market is a wonderful and valid thing to do. However, government has been continually challenged because affordable housing as a gross delivery model isn't actually stacking up financially for builders and developers. In the case of landlords, and sometimes people are a little bit surprised to hear someone like me say this, I actually feel for landlords, particularly the small landlord who was inspired by Bertie Ahern back in the early noughties to go off and create their own pension scheme, buy a property or two. They are being driven out of the market because they are overtaxed. Like they're paying up to 52% tax on their income. And then legislation for tenants has continually given people a lot more rights. Now, if you have a good tenant who pays their rent every month, that's great. But equally, if you have a tenant who's been a little bit problematic or not paying rent, and you're not an experienced landlord, it can be horrific. And I suppose a lot of factors have led landlords to be leaving the market en masse. Back in the early noughties, this has been well commented on in the past. Building social housing ceased, and private rented accommodation became the exit for people who could either needed to exit homelessness or couldn't actually get on a social housing waiting list and be subsequently housed. We've found that, say, for example, again in Kilkenny, in the last 2 years, HAP properties have have gone down from something like 890 homes in Kilkenny to 760.
Well, it's a big drop.
Yeah, and after the moratorium, because when this moratorium ends, be it March, May, or June, we all know we're going to continue to see landlords stepping out of their role as landlord and putting their properties on the market. Another challenge is, and then I'll finish, I promise, that last year the delivery target was 9,500. Government then readjusted that to 8,500, but the actual delivery for house builds was 7,000. Oh. So it's poor. We're also seeing that planning permissions are not at a level that supports 9,000 or 10,000 units being delivered a year, and commencement notices, certainly at the moment, are also not supporting delivery on that scale. So inflation is true. Inflation and many of the other challenges and problems that are in the way of actually delivering house builds remains to be extremely challenging. And I don't envy Minister O'Brien.
Right.
Could I jump in on a couple of those points, if that's okay, Noel?
Oh, absolutely.
I would definitely agree with your sentiments. Just in terms of the rent increases in Kilkenny up 12%, I do have an issue in relation to the data that is driving a lot of government decisions. One of the property portals basically Daft is the only mechanism or company out there that's actually putting together data, and the media jumps on that data. That data is not fit for purpose, because that data is not a true reflection of rent increases. We manage in the region of 350 properties. Waterford is reported as the highest rent increase in Ireland in the last quarter. That's not correct, because that data does not represent sitting tenants' rent increases because of the rent pressure zone. Also, you've got only a small amount of data that does not reflect the true picture. So the majority of estate agents, we do not, across the country, advertise properties. So as you well know, Noel, at the moment, like today in Waterford, there are 12 properties advertised. Any given time, it could be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, no more than that. And they're basing their data on those numbers. And I think we've got a rent pressure zone. I think that's probably the single biggest issue in relation to the rental crisis that's driving landlords out, because there are certain landlords that I'm dealing with a lot of whose rents are 5, 6, 7, 800 euros, drastically below fair market rent. So the government needs to sit up, in my opinion, because when this embargo lifts, whether it's, as you said, Noel, March, April, May, June, we are looking at a massive car crash beyond what's here, because there's more landlords leaving. And I keep hearing politicians saying, well, this is going to create more stock for buyers. No. We have people who have to rent. Even if you look at people, transient society, we need rental property for nurses, workers coming into the country, staff working in pharma, working in hospitals, all the rest, people who can't buy, and I look at 167 properties for sale today in Waterford City. I've counted them and I've looked at them and studied them, and I reckon 50 of them are rental properties as we speak today. That's even before the embargo's lifted. So what is the plan that the government have? And this is really the only plan they seem to have is block notice to quit, which is actually infuriating landlords more. They're punishing the supplier of the stock instead of saying, what can we do to try and keep them?
Yeah, definitely. And it's something we'll go back to certainly before the end of the programme. Joanne, you've been sitting there very, very patiently, and I'm sure you've heard a lot. As regards mortgages, has the Roisin
new rules,
new rules, has that had an impact?
Yeah, so I suppose, so this year the first-time buyers can now get up to 4 times and still at the 90%. But I suppose, yeah, look, that's across the various lenders in the market. But I suppose what we are seeing in reality, some of the lenders, then when you plug in the 4 times the income, for low to middle income earners, they've also, because of the stress testing with interest rates increasing and also inflation and the cost of living, their criteria has tightened. So like there's one particular lender, when you plug in the 4 times, unless you're on a combined or a sole income of over 70,000, you can only get 3.5 times with them, regardless of whether you're a first-time buyer or not. So when you actually drill down into their calculator, you can't get 4 times unless you're on over 70,000 euros. So I suppose, look, and that's the reality of, we'll say, the stress testing and the cost of living crisis. The other lenders, so not all the lenders are as harsh as that, but I suppose, look, there's a squeeze in the mortgage lenders as well. As a broker, we've access to all of the lenders, we've agencies with them all. But I suppose, look, the non-pillar banks that are there, they're squeezed for funding as well at the moment. So they are a bit more expensive, and they haven't been as active as it has been in the last 3 years. So I suppose the mortgage market itself is a little bit tighter there. So the 3-pillar banks are under a bit more pressure. So we have seen a lot of delays and backlogs with the banks in the last 6 to 9 months. So I suppose a lot of them have, and I suppose, look, with Ulster Bank and KBC leaving as well, that has had pressure on the banks. So a lot of the banks have now staffed up. But I suppose just in terms of the 4 times, yeah, it's there, but there is still strict lending criteria to get it. It's not going to help as that much the low to middle income earners. So with that in mind, who's it going to help? It's going to help the middle to high income earners, and therefore, could potentially put a little bit more of a squeeze on house prices. So there is the potential for that. I suppose just in terms of solutions, yes, I suppose like an equity scheme on second-hand homes would be welcome. I suppose I can see why the government didn't do it also, because I suppose they really want to focus on getting new supply out there. So I suppose that's why they've focused on the new builds. But absolutely, we can see it in Limerick City. If you look at properties for sale in Limerick City, a second-hand in a housing estate, a 3-bed, average size house, it's about 100,000 cheaper than the brand new estate, the same house in a 3-bed brand new estate. So there is value in the second hand, and I suppose that's reflective of the market, inflation, cost prices with builders and steel, concrete, and all the building rises as well. So there is a bit more value in the second hand. So I suppose, look, that's where those low to middle income earners would really afford. If there was a first home scheme or a government equity share in second-hand houses, then they would have a bit more of affordability on those type of dwellings. But yeah, I suppose I can see why the government has pushed it that way, but they're going to have to look at other measures. And I suppose even with the help to buy, and we're talking about planning permission there, the self-builds are very difficult as well from a mortgage perspective. They tend to be a little bit more tricky. It does tend to be a little bit more expensive as well when the bank look at it and cost it. So they have a minimum that they'll accept. All the lenders have a minimum cost per square foot that they'll accept to deem that the house can be built for this amount per square foot. And that varies between the lenders. And that has rose again in the last 12 months in line with cost prices. But I suppose even with the help to buy, so they're limited to their 30,000. I think maybe for self-builds, they should increase that threshold from the 30,000 to maybe even up to 50 or 60,000, I think would be more there useful for that. And then I suppose there is more stuff coming on stream again with renovations and the empty properties and stuff like that. But I suppose the other thing then is on landlords and the tax treatment there for their income. And if there was some kind of an interest relief or something as well now available for them, a bit more reliefs on their income tax, because effectively they are at the 52%, or to try and encourage some more private landlords into the market. There is some kind of a scheme that they could maybe look at again to do something on that as well.
And Joanne, are you seeing examples of any people that say they're approved for a mortgage, but they haven't been able to draw it down because, it's very hard to find anything within their price range?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we had found there towards in the last couple of weeks in December, a few more had gone sale agreed. I suppose there can be, in every market there can be delays with probate and certificates of title in terms of issues with, even we've seen with some properties that had been built maybe 5 or 6 years ago, had been left watertight and now refinished, and the original engineers, and there are problems then with the bank. So they really need a cash buyer. So there can be difficulties getting mortgages on those. So yeah, I suppose we have seen a lot of people coming back now that had been house hunters for all of last year and haven't found a property and have come back now for their 4 times. But there is a good number, I suppose, in that low to middle income earners that, you know, everything is still outside of their range. And even you can see sometimes that with self-builds as well. So they might even have the site gifted, but they have planning for a particular type of or size of a house, but the max mortgage they can get isn't affordable to build the house as per the lender's criteria. So that stalls them there as well. So yeah, I suppose there has been issues on all fronts there.
Absolutely. And the biggest provider of social homes is the local authorities. And Noel, you would deal with the county councils, on Kilkenny County Council in particular. Are the county councils, are they resourced enough to deliver and meet the demand that's there?
Well, I actually deal with 4 local authorities at this stage.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's just a small change. I would say, generally speaking, local authorities do not have the staffing levels required to actually deliver the actual amount of units that are required. Local authority works a little bit like a bank broker as well, in that if AHBs or the local authority themselves are seeking funding to build, they'll very much kind of broker that. And they have a lot of different tasks and roles in the delivery of property. And they are not resourced at a level that kind of that goes anywhere near the demands that they're placed under. And that's one of the strangleholds. As well as that, a lot of the local authorities would also be challenged in terms of their own cash flow and their overdrafts. 1 or 2 of the local authorities I deal with, because they're relatively small, their overdrafts are quite small. So in terms of moving money through to pay for construction or to pay for acquisitions, it's very, very slow, and it's very, very, very cumbersome. And it leads to a lot of unnecessary blocks and challenges. Yeah, that's just some of the challenges for the poor local authorities.
And is it fair to say, Noel, without the approved housing bodies like the Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association and many others that are well known, to present what would actually be built in terms of social housing would be even smaller?
Yeah, I would say so. But like Paul, if you actually think about it, we have a scheme coming on stream in 2 weeks' time. I started working on that scheme 4 years ago.
Oh.
And the builder will finish in 2 weeks' time. So it's taken 4 years of various challenges with funding, challenges with planning and onboard Panola, challenges with that is taking way, way too long. We have to find ways of doing rapid builds, and you know, I'm not saying do away with the planning system, because we need planning, and communities and local businesses should have a say. So I'm not interested in taking away people's rights. What I am interested in is speeding up the process. 12 apartments that take maybe 12 to 14 months to build, another 3 years was lost, and some of that was on rhetoric, and that's unfortunate.
It is.
I think another thing there, just on that, is on the funding piece as well, the development finance. I suppose no lender has really replaced what Anglo was doing in the market either. So there is a real gap in the market for a lender to come in and take the development risk and lend to developers, because that's where I suppose a lot of the issues are as well with the developers, in terms of not being able to get finance and funding to actually build the developments at scale. So I suppose that is a huge challenge that remains. And I suppose it's like, even a lot of the banks they're not open for development risk. They're not open for that. housing development risk. They just won't do it. It's not policy, and they're closed shop for that. So I suppose it's just even around the government maybe incentivizing a lender or some other type of a fund to come in to help with that as well, because that is a huge challenge for developers.
So Joanne, just on one question there, we were talking about young people and we were talking about applying for mortgage, and like for Regina to go and look, even see what can I even get a mortgage? What hurdles are you finding apart from their salaries, and then the cost of housing and the rise of buying a house and the cost to buy a house? What challenges are you finding that young people, and I'm say from 35 down, are finding when they're going to look for a mortgage?
Yeah, I suppose just to run through, I suppose, some of the things that they require, and then where they're coming a cropper with some things. So I suppose they need 6 months to provide 6 months bank statements, and they also need a clean credit history. So even if historically they've had credit issues, like a credit card that they didn't pay as a student in college. Yeah. That needs to be closed and cleared. So it's no good thinking, I had this credit card, then I moved to Australia, then I came back again, I just ignored that credit card. They must have wrote it off because I don't hear no more about it. But that is sitting in your background, and that will rear its head when you go get a mortgage, because it'll say, there was this credit card that was never paid. You got it in Rag Week in college. You put 200 euros on it. You never paid it. And now they wrote it off after interest and charges for a couple of years writing to you. And there's 1,000 euros wrote off now, because it really tots up on a credit card interest at 20%. So like that, we are finding people with issues like that, never knew about them, and then they rear their head when they get a credit report. So that tends to be a regular one. And what you need to do, so when that does rear its head, you need to fess up, pay it, clear it, and close that credit card if it's still up on the system, or else you need to explain why you never. So I suppose lenders don't tend to like if you just ignored it and pretended that it never happened. So you need to have shown that you've dealt with it. And a lot of lenders have a 2-year clear water policy. So they'll want you to have cleared and closed that for 2 years before you can then apply for a mortgage. So that's kind of one thing. Now so a credit card is a small amount of that. I suppose, look, we've come through a crash, so people will have had issues in with borrowings and that. Once they dealt with them and they're, everything is settled now and there's nothing outstanding, nothing on interest only, and they're 2 years down the line, in general, that tends to be acceptable to lenders. I suppose childcare fees then are another big one. They can be as much as a mortgage. So I suppose for low to middle income earners, they'll, a lot of them probably won't realistically be able to afford a mortgage and childcare costs. So that does tend to be a problem, and it is like a cost that's added in. So their affordability dwindles then when that's significant. I suppose I suppose all the lenders do accept if you are, so I suppose they look at your 4 times, and then they look, okay, if your mortgage is 200,000 over 25 years, approximately that'd be about 1,000 euros a month. You need to have saving or been paying rent for up to 1,000 euros for the last 6 months. So I suppose show that in your accounts as well. Sometimes people will have taken out money out of their savings account. So for the 6 months, it has to be a consistent increase of 1,000 euros with no lump sum withdrawals. And I suppose, look, things like gambling and stuff like that is a big no-no as well. As far as lenders are concerned, they would deem that to be a risk. So a lot of the time that could be an issue for people. But yeah, I suppose the other things then last year seemed to be the year of the mortgage switcher, but it also seemed to be the year of the switcher for people switching jobs. So there is a few lenders that will not let you draw down while you're on probation, or they won't let you progress to a loan offer while you're on probation. So a lot of the time when you change jobs, you go on probation and you're on a 6 months probation. With the public service, there are some roles that is 12 months probation, and you could be on contract for a number of years as well. So I suppose contracts, probation, and maternity leave is the other issue that has come around. So somebody goes on maternity leave, and okay, it might be paid for 4 or 6 months, but then they're on unpaid leave, and the lender won't let you draw down until you've returned to work, got one payslip back at work, and a letter confirming, it depends on the lender, a letter confirming that you're returning to work on the same salary and the same role and the same full time as you had been previously. And I suppose that's been a bit of an issue as well with some lenders. And I suppose you can see with childcare costs that it does seem to be the case for women that a lot of them don't return full time after children. So some lenders have really picked up on that. I suppose what we've seen just recently now is some banks are also saying for people in the IT sector, they want a letter for their employer. If their employer is one of the employers that has recently announced some job cuts, they want a letter confirming that you've not been impacted. So that can be difficult for people to get. So there is a range of issues ongoing there.
And that makes it really hard for anyone who's sharing a house, maybe paying, if you said that it was €1,000 rent, €1,000 saving, and if they're living in a shared house, which lots and lots, majority of the under 30s are, no matter where they're living now, they're sharing houses because they cannot find even a room to rent now. Even finding a room to rent is like winning the gold dust lottery. So that is well, even in that cap of that amount of how much they need to be paying rent and how much they need to be saving.
And either or now. Either or. Sorry, it's either or. So they either need to be saving the 1,000 or renting 1,000.
Oh, either same.
Sorry,
okay,
either or. Yeah,
either or. That's okay.
And then if they don't have any savings, I suppose the help to buy can help if it's a brand new property. But if it's secondhand, the help to buy isn't there. So the help to buy is like it's your money back. It's a tax relief on the income tax you've paid for the last 4 years. So it's like getting your tax back to help you towards the purchase price. But that's only available on new builds and up to a maximum purchase price of 500,000 or 10% of the property value.
Do you mind if I say something? There's something in Irish culture that everyone has to follow in the footsteps of their parents, and particularly around housing. So typically, if your parents were in social housing, the chances are you would equally find yourself following that path and going into social housing. But again, if your parents bought their property, paid the mortgage, struggled through the 80s and the 90s, you'll very much be of that ilk. There probably needs to be a slight shift in our culture in that, our self-worth doesn't need to be set around property ownership. If you consider many European countries, there's some great models where people pay a very affordable rent, who are professionals, middle income earners, and below, and it's more than acceptable. So I do think there needs to be a bit of a shift in our culture. We don't necessarily need to own our own homes. One of the greatest challenges around that shift in culture is that in the 80s, our housing system became a welfare housing system. And what we seen was properties being let for very, very low rents, and equally properties being sold very, very cheaply, which interestingly, back in the kind of early noughties, when we were seeing massive increases in property prices, we were seeing some of those properties being bought back for 2 and 3 times what they were sold to the original tenants for. What we do need is a public housing system, one that can work with people of any income and assist them find rental properties which are of reasonable quality and reasonably priced. Because our growing economy very much needs that for people who are coming in on a temporary basis, be it for 1 year or for 3 or 4 years to work. And a public housing system would very, very, very much support and manage housing allocations in a whole mix of circumstances.
Yeah, and it would be a great help to those people that are in the middle. They would be over the threshold for, like, say, local authority support, but don't earn enough to get a mortgage. So that middle bracket would be a huge help to them, and would doing a cost rental in Kilkenny, and I know you're working in other counties as well. Would that be something you'd like to do, you know, if the resources and the will was there to do it?
The money doesn't stack up, Paul. That's the unfortunate, that cost rentals at the minute are really only geared towards 2-bed apartments. An awful lot of developers are walking away from them because really apartments are at the more expensive end to build, with there being so much instability in inflation. Like, I know we're hearing a lot of talk about things beginning to level out within the cost of living crisis, but cement is due to go up in the next week or two.
Right.
So there's certain areas that haven't stabilized yet. And while we're in that type of environment, everyone gets nervous and reluctant, and it just kind of exacerbates the challenges that are there already.
Absolutely.
Can I jump in there? I think Noel, you've a very measured approach, and it's the first time I've met you, so it's really great to hear you speak. Everything you're saying makes a huge amount of sense, and I think in terms of the rental model you're speaking about in other international cities, you're right. I have a friend in Vienna. He's lived all his life. He's a retired professor, and his wife, professional people, they've always rented. All their friends rent, they all rent, but there is stability and it's long-term rental. And if that was to work in Ireland, you have to have, if you're relying on the private sector to provide some of that supply, it does have to be commercially viable. And the government need to take a big picture view on that in terms of it being a win-win, you know, because if somebody has a rent of €500, and I know several people who've had rents of €500, they pay tax of 52%, they pay all these other charges, they pay, and sure, by the end of it, it's a bit of a joke going to the bank with what you've got left. And then in some cases, the property has been left in very bad condition and they're just browned off with the whole thing. So I do think that's something where the tenants aren't paying exorbitant rent. I know somebody said to me recently they'd like 1,800 for their house rent, and I just thought, Jeannie Mac, that is a lot of rent. You know, it's a lot. It's a lot for someone who isn't earning, you know, massive money like in the financial centre in Dublin. That'd be small change really, but just for the general person looking to rent, it's a huge amount of money. And then what's happening is, because the rent pressure zone is a big issue, because if somebody is renting a property out for the first time, they're going to go for the top price.
Absolutely.
Because if they rented at 1,000 and say, oh, they're a nice tenant, they can only afford 1,000, that's fine. I'm going to pay, actually it's in the region of 58% tax. But they can't do that because they're locked in at that rate with the 2% increase thereafter. So to me, that's a really significant issue. And I think it ties in with what you're saying, Noel. So I just wanted to add that to it.
And I suppose, Regina, as well, when you go outside the major urban areas, Waterford, it is a major urban area as well, the majority of landlords, they are, you know, people with just maybe 1-2 properties. They're not,
for sure, you know, 76% of landlords, 76% of the properties are owned by owners who only own 1 or 2, and they're accidental landlords, or they've invested in one property, you know, for their pension.
And from what you're hearing, Joanne, do you see more landlords exiting in the coming months?
Yeah, absolutely. That definitely does seem to be the case. And I suppose even when you get a buy-to-let inquiry, and you initially, you know, like I suppose because they, from a commercial viewpoint as well, 70% is the maximum loan to value for that a lender will do. So they'll finance 70%, and the purchaser has to come up with 30%. And then I suppose the rental has to stack up as well. But a lot of the pillar banks will also need to assess you financially as well. So if there is a problem with the rental market, they want the fallback on you. So they will look at your employment and income as well. And they'll also stress test the rent and the interest rates. So it's very, you know, so a buy-to-let can be quite difficult. So I suppose the non-pillar bank lenders that had been in the market for the past couple of years, the likes of ICS and Finance Ireland, had been really welcome, because they definitely look at buy-to-lets differently. But I suppose the squeeze is on with them now at the moment in terms of their funding and interest rates. So they're not as active in the market. But they had been a good choice, because they did look at the rental income, and they took less of a view on your own income funding the shortfall. They just wanted the rental to stack up, so they weren't as focused on your income as well. But with them not there, definitely there is issues. And I suppose we are hearing it all the time that a lot of the secondhand properties that are coming up, they were rental properties, so the landlords are exiting the market, and I suppose just issues with getting sick of being a landlord, and then interest rates going up. They're just.
And I think just I think we would never meet investors who are getting mortgages for investment properties. They're all cash buyers. But I think a great opportunity would be around people investing through their pension funds. We could attract a new cohort. Like, a lot of landlords that are selling up as well are selling up because of enormous negative equity, low rents. Like, I know a family who bought a number of apartments in Waterford. They paid close on to 400,000. When the crash happened in 2007, they were worth 10% of what they paid for them. They were worth 30,000. In today's market, those properties are worth 120, right? So if you could imagine their mortgage payments, the rent pressure zone come in, the mortgage payments were greater. The whole thing was just an enormous headache. But for a new property investor or somebody buying for their pension fund, at 120,000, that's a bargain, right? Mm-hmm. So you could attract people buying through their funds buying, or individuals buying through their pension, but they're not going to buy if the rent pressure zone is so restrictive. So I keep going back to that. There are opportunities if the government listen. And I think the whole negativity towards landlords it just doesn't make sense, because we're shooting the people who are providing the supply, because there is no alternative supply.
And that's where I was thinking about this. We have 3 housing experts here, 3 people who come, your expertise. If we were sitting in cabinet and we were coming up with the solutions to the housing crisis and homelessness, what set of solutions would you say that the government and the politicians should be listening to the people on the ground? And how would you solve the housing crisis?
I'll jump in first with a couple, and I won't talk too long. I think Noel hit on in terms of resources with the councils. So there's no silver bullet. That's the first thing, right? It is a complex issue, and there's a lot of things that need to be looked at. But resources, nobody can function without resources. I think the resources within the councils is a huge issue. I think it's an enormous issue within planning framework, and that planners, they need to be looking at the private sector to collaborate or subcontract if that's needed. There are lots of professional planners who should be engaged by the council on contract. Definitely tax is something to be looked at. Definitely in terms of property owners. The vulture funds have unfavourable terms. They have better terms, should I say, compared to the Mary and Frank couple. That's very unfair. We need a more level playing field. And I do think the point I made about more shared equity for people at certain levels for second-hand home purchases, I think that's very important. And I'd love to see an ombudsman for housing where there's a long-term strategic approach, as opposed to everyone fighting politics, and they're looking at 5 years and satisfying the populist vote.
That's really good, because it's common sense. Now, if we had a common sense approach like this, we would solve the housing crisis. a lot quicker than what it's been awful for the last 10 years anyway, at least, and it's getting worse. So Joanne, what would be your common sense solutions in your areas of expertise?
Yeah, so I suppose, look, the supply needs to be increased. So something on development finance, or some, even if they, pulled in the pillar banks to reopen themselves up in some meaningful way for developers, I think that would be helpful. I think if they expanded the Help to Buy scheme and the first home shared equity schemes, either increase the threshold of the equity that they're willing to provide there, or else extend it onto the second-hand properties. And I suppose maybe the other thing is to incentivize landlords to come back into the market, because we do need an active rental market as well. So if they had some way of incentivizing those landlords through some kind of help on the tax on the rental income there, that would be something as well that would be favourable. So they would be some of the measures, I think.
Are house prices just too unreachable and unaffordable for the ordinary Joe Soap?
Our house prices?
Yeah, just too unaffordable and too high priced.
Yeah, I suppose that really is it. For low to middle income earners, there is not a lot of options out there. So renting really is their only option. And I suppose, it's about opening up the rental market then to get them something that they can deem affordable. I suppose the county councils do have some schemes as well, but just not enough for those that, if you get 2 declines from lenders, you can go to the county councils, but I suppose they're very limited as well, and they haven't, they're not bridging enough of the gap that's there either. So if they could expand and do more there.
And with just one quick point, don't forget that people have to raise 10% deposit.
Yes.
Like that is very, very difficult for some people. So if you go back to the point I made about Mary, if she only had to pay 5,000 deposit and then have a shared equity with the government, if that was reinstated, like for some people to come up with 20 or 30,000, that's wild. Yeah.
Big chunk of money.
Yeah.
If I could just come in, people have very much reflected on the housing piece. I very much agree with Regina. Take politics out of the housing solution. We should have a 20-year plan, and a plan that's not changed by a political methodology or agenda. It should be a plan that ministers have to facilitate and deliver upon. That's very clear. If I could reflect something in terms of homelessness, because we're seeing that for both ends, it's really interesting. A city like Copenhagen has a population of around 7 million people. It has one hostel with 50 beds.
Wow.
And what it is quite simply, it's intake, and people are gone within a couple of days, and they're gone into a housing solution.
Okay.
It's a very, very different approach to homelessness. Of course, the greatest fix or the greatest cure for homelessness is to prevent it in the first place. And I suppose there are many, many circumstances that people find themselves in. A lot of people still believe in this country that if you become homeless, you've done something wrong and it's your fault. I have a hostel in Kilkenny full of people who are working, who have fallen out of the private rented market and have been unable to access private rented accommodation. What we are beginning to do is develop alternatives to hotels and hostels. For instance, we've introduced a scheme that houses 13 families and 25 single people. It saves the exchequer in terms of hotels and hostels just over $1 million a year, but it promotes much better outcomes, particularly for children. We have found since 2007, and when the whole glare went on hotel use as a response to particularly families and to particularly children, we now have children talking about suicide at 7 and 8 years of age. We now have children talking about being depressed. We have children studying for their junior cert and their leaving cert in an ensuite in a hotel room. We need to have some principles here where we say certain things are unacceptable, and no child should be in a hotel.
100%.
100%. And when you
Noel, what do you think of the banning of bench sits? Was that not a ludicrous thing to do?
Absolutely. It was one of the most stupidest things I've ever seen in my life. Lifting standards and banning things are two different things. Of course, we should have improved standards, right? I have spent my whole life sharing a bathroom, right? That hasn't changed, and I'm 54 years of age. Yeah, it was absolutely ludicrous, because if you look at the increasing number of people who came into homelessness at that time were the vulnerable, middle-aged or elderly people, many of whom had mental health issues, and they were torn out of their home, and they were happy there. They had no complaints at all. So I absolutely agree with Regina. That should never have happened. There's nothing wrong with bed sits.
Well, I'll be meeting the Minister for Housing on Monday, and I'll be raising that.
Oh. Yeah, good.
And I completely agree with you that we need to take housing out of politics.
Mm.
And no child should be living in a hotel bedroom, and no one should be homeless. And we need to change the whole narrative around homelessness. As Noel said, it's all as well. The homelessness, if they can't get a mortgage and they can't go to an auctioneer and find a house to live, or even a rental, a room to rent in a shared house, the homelessness is going to get worse. And again, it's a vicious circle. You can't get a mortgage because you can't show that you're saving, and and you're paying rent.
Just to paint a picture, and I'm sure Noel has a lot of very sad stories, but we had a gentleman go down on his knees and actually beg my colleague to rent the property to him. Right? And like the amount of people that we have in our office, we're a commercial business, but crying. I had a lady there last week, and all I could give her was a cup of coffee. She had a brand new baby in the buggy. And I just said, look, I can't give you a property, but I want you to sit down and have a cup of coffee and let's have a chat. Now, I rang a very good counsellor, friend of mine, who might be able to help her. But I just think the politicians just have no clue as to what really is going on.
They're living in a bubble.
Yeah.
And all they think about is their PR and getting votes.
The one thing that sometimes people forget is that homelessness in itself is a trauma. And that if you've had an earlier trauma from childhood, this trauma evokes an awful lot of distress and hopelessness. When we seen the big turn on the crash in 2007, we had working, sophisticated families coming in looking for help because they were being evicted from their private rented housing. And they were shocked, absolutely shocked, that they were maybe possibly being lucky enough to be offered a hotel room. And I suppose it's probably for me become the greatest sin of our time. Like we are now, we've seen 7 months of successive increases to homeless figures that we've probably not seen since the Irish famine. And I don't mean to be over elaborate, but I don't think we've seen anything like this.
Yeah.
And it is a time now for change. It's not the small landlord's fault. It's not the developer's fault. I just think at the end of the day, we need really good leadership and really solid solutions, driven through regional mechanisms. One of the biggest problems, like I have a particular figure. We have bought 30 properties leading up to October of last year in Carlow, and 2 of those properties were from homeowners, and the other 28 had been previously private rented, and were now being put on the market. And that was quite telling of what is emerging slowly but surely across Carlow, in that, in particular, landlords are getting out. And I think they're very resentful. And I think they're partly right to feel that way. Because at the end of the day, the mechanisms to protect their interests and to allow them to have a modicum of a decent income hasn't really been protected. And yet they'll see big companies sweeping in, buying hundreds of properties under a much different tax system. And I think there's something terribly unfair if you're a small landlord to experience that.
Yeah.
And no, what is the statistics on homelessness now to date? How many people are homeless in Ireland?
11,753 was January's figure. Now, what you have to remember is that doesn't include people who are rough sleeping. Mm-hmm. There are also a couple of thousand people in hubs or in other forms of accommodation who are technically homeless, but they're not counted that way. It doesn't include people who are sofa surfing. It doesn't include Mary, who's living alone and who has 2 children returned because they're forced out of the housing market. So some people would say that the number actually goes into the early 20,000s.
Wow. And that it could be even more as well.
Well, I wouldn't like to go there. But certainly it's significantly more.
Yeah.
Than the figure recorded. Because remember, the figure recorded is those who are accessing emergency accommodation.
Yes.
And it's quite pointed like that.
And as you said, there's many 2 children come back to mommy and daddy and come back to the old bedrooms that they grew up with and did the Leaving Cert in, to even just because 1, they're out of the rental market, 2, they're saving that big 10% deposit to buy the house.
Yeah.
That isn't even there to buy because they're not building new houses, and an awful lot of people are, and again, big landlords are coming in and buying the big houses, and it's just really worrying now for our young children and the young people, and especially people under 35.
Yeah, and probably one of the biggest numbers of people coming into homelessness at the moment are the elderly.
Yes.
Tell us about that, Noel.
No, we're just finding, like, when I first started working in homeless services 100 years ago, it was 97% men and 3% women. Then we seen this big trend in the mid to late noughties, where we started seeing a significant amount of women starting to come into homeless services, where we probably seen some years, year in, up to 45%. And homeless services aren't built for women. And I know that sounds like a strange thing to say.
No.
Homeless services health elements are most certainly not built for women. So we've been really, really challenged over the last 10 years in terms of how we respond to that. More recently, we're seeing more and more people coming in with disabilities, mental health issues, or the elderly. And these were people who 10, 12 years ago, if someone appeared, it was treated like a localized national crisis. Whereas now it's become ordinary. We're seeing, if you look at, we have a hostel in Kilkenny with 37 people in it, and there's around 7 people now over the age of 60 there. 10 years ago, that would have been 1 or 2. So we are seeing a significant increase, because when people are squeezed, it's the vulnerable groups who end up the most exposed. And unfortunately, in this country, one of the most vulnerable groups is actually the elderly, or those people with a disability or with a significant mental health issue.
And wouldn't that be an opportunity then, Noel, in terms of bed sits, and the last thing, I mean, it doesn't make sense to have houses under occupied. Do you know what I mean? So, we need to be looking at social housing and how many people are in a property and how many are allocated it. So but again, engagement with stakeholders is needed. I know, I can tell you that the Minister for Housing has not engaged with the professional body for estate agents in a meaningful way. And so they're not really getting the core issues and understanding, well, here are the solutions. Don't want to be berating anyone, but let's look at how are we going to resolve this and take it bit by bit. And listening to you, Noel, I mean, that problem is only going to get worse if they don't change what's happening, because A lot of these people are in the private sector. They're renting properties. These landlords are vacating the market. These people will become homeless. As I said, I've counted 50 properties that I'm convinced out of 167 are at least 50 are rental properties. Wow. So if you've got older people there, and I mean, a lot of these people, the only income they have is their state pension. Sure, what's that going to cover? You know?
Yeah, not very much, I'm afraid.
No. Joined up thinking, and like it is our home, as I often say, it's one of our 3 primary needs: food, clothes, and a roof over our head. It has to be the most significant, important issue alongside health. But again, you could say it's in front of health, because without a home, you have no health.
True.
Yeah, definitely. And Joanne, you know, as well, for young people, the cost of living is going up, and even trying to even save that €1,000 a month for a mortgage, and then the scrutiny of they must feel when they're going for the mortgage, their whole lives are being really scrutinized and under a microscope.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like there is a lot of scrutiny. I suppose the lender does query every transaction on their account as well, over €500. So if they're randomly taking out cash regularly, they will look and see, is there a trend there, and query that. So there is a lot of scrutiny when they do assess a mortgage. So yeah, I suppose first-time buyers and second-time buyers, they do feel that definite scrutiny as well. But yeah, that's interesting on the homeless front as well. I suppose it's definitely a problem that's growing. So it's interesting, that I'd agree with your holistic view on the property, and rather take the politics out of it and have a long-term strategy and view on it. That definitely makes sense.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. But, you know, Paul and I really appreciate each one of you for coming on and talking about this.
Absolutely.
We need to actually
fantastic.
Coming up with solutions, don't we, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. This is an issue that is not, there's no one silver bullet, Roisin, that's going to solve it. But I think we've definitely we've opened up and we've looked at different facets of it, and I've learned a lot as well from this program. So thanks very, very much to all our guests, to Joanne Madden of Mortgage ABC, to Regina Mangan from Liberty Blue Auctioneers based in Waterford, and to Noel Sherry, CEO of the Good Shepherd Centre and Kilkenny Voluntary Housing Association. Thank you very much for your time.
And
Thank you.
Thanks.